Good morning. We're continuing our study of the genealogy of Jesus, and we are having a real fun time with Noah right now. So much so, we are in our third week of Noah, which is absolutely fine. I think we've had really good contemplation about not just these people themselves, but the things that they represent, the things that God was completing through them, and how he was really giving us these hints at what was to come. And I want to finish kind of talking about that as far as Noah is concerned. Beyond Genesis, I do want to still cover the remainder of this that I had prepared, because I think it's really important, because Noah on his own in Genesis is an extremely important figure, because, well, he saves mankind from being destroyed completely, if you kind of look at the way the world was at that point. So yes, he's extremely important there, but his actions also provide a lot of symbolism for us later on in the Bible that harkens back to Noah and the flood and the occurrences that went there, so that we can have an even deeper understanding of not just what Noah was doing in his time, but how that has implications and applications to us today, and how we serve God. So I want to continue with that, if you don't mind. Last week, we finished up talking about Noah's role in Genesis, and we talked a little bit about Isaiah chapter 54, looking at its context, how the previous chapter, Isaiah chapter 53, is clearly all about Christ. One, we know that because you see the description of what is being written, and it's clearly talking about Jesus and the crucifixion, but also that is the passage that the Ethiopian eunuch was reading from when Philip goes to him and says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And they have a conversation, and he gets to the point where he understands about Jesus from that passage and says, "Here's water. Why shouldn't I be baptized?" Chapter 54, even though we have these chapter breaks here, does not seem to be Isaiah moving on to a new subject. He seems to be continuing his thoughts of Isaiah chapter 53. So I think when we look at that in context, and it talks about Noah there in chapter 54 of Isaiah, that we're seeing an application of using Noah as an example to that context, similar to Isaiah chapter 53. So we talked about that quite a bit last week. That's as far as we got. I still have one other Old Testament passage I want to look at, and then we'll move on to the New Testament and talk about that, unless anyone has any more things we want to talk about with Isaiah chapter 54. I think I kind of made all the points I wanted to as far as that chapter goes. Okay, go ahead and turn to Ezekiel chapter 14. We're going to move on to another passage now. Of course, another prophet here, Ezekiel. Someone read for us Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 through 23. Let's do 12 through 23, please.
Or if I send a pestilence into the land and pour out my fury on it in blood, sword and famine and wild beast and pestilence, to cut off man and beast from it. Yet behold, there shall be left in it a remnant who will be brought out, both sons and daughters. Sure they will come out to you, and you will see their way and their doings. Then you will be comforted concerning the disaster that I have brought upon Jerusalem, all that I have brought upon it. They will comfort you when you see their ways and their doings, and you shall know that I have done nothing without cause, that I have done in it, says the Lord.
Okay, thank you. I know that was a bit lengthy, but I think getting a little bit of more of what the passage is talking about rather than just, oh, Noah's name is mentioned here, gives us a little bit more of an idea of what's going on. Because when we look at this chapter, and a lot of Ezekiel and a lot of the prophets for this matter are like this, God is basically laying out a case against Jerusalem as far as its status of wickedness. In his judgment against the people, the city would not be spared, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the city. Though these righteous men themselves would be saved, but only themselves, not anyone else with them by proxy, if you will. I think a little bit, when I think about this, I think of the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham is talking to God, well, if 50 righteous people were in the city, would you spare it? He said, yeah, for 50 I would spare it. And he gets all the way down to 10. You know, for just 10 righteous people, would you spare the city? And he says, yes, I would spare it. I don't know if that's any sort of parallel here, but God is saying, even if these very three righteous men, so when we have these three righteous men, we have Job, we have Daniel, we have Noah. These are pretty well known, all very righteous men, all very faithful in how they served God. And Noah just happens to be the one we're talking about right now. He says, even if Noah and guys like him, a few guys like him, they're not going to be, equivalent to the 10 men that are in Sodom that are going to spare that city. Now, I don't know if that's we could look at this and say, well, Jerusalem must be even more wicked than Sodom was at that time, because not even these three righteous people would make it so. But then you could say, well, God never got down to 3 men with Sodom, and we had Lot get out. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds there on that. But I think the case here, the point here God is making is that this city is so wicked, even the remnant of the righteous is not going to cause that city to be spared because the wickedness is so great. And this is what we see. He talks about Daniel as one of those three. Daniel is taken into captivity. Now, he's not killed like many of the wicked in Jerusalem at the time, but he is taken into captivity. He lives his entire remaining life in captivity, or at least he's not in Judah. He's not in Jerusalem. He spends all of his remaining days outside of the promised land. He never goes back, which is, in a way, kind of sad to think about, because he was a righteous man. He did the right things, and yet he's not given that privilege of going back to Jerusalem, to go back to a rebuilt temple, which sounds kind of sad, kind of almost like an injustice, but Daniel was doing a greater work than that. His job was somewhere else. That's a little bit of an aside, but I think, again, this shows the essence of a declaration, how wicked the nation had become, that a few righteous would be spared, though very few in number, as we know what happens to Jerusalem later on. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to go into captivity. God is basically letting him know this is what's going to happen. You may say, well, we've got, at least, X number of righteous people, or we have the temple of the Lord. That's not going to stop God's judgment. And I think when we think about this in maybe a New Testament context or today, do we say, well, I've done a few things correctly, so that should make me okay with God? I think Jeff kind of mentioned this last week or the week before. We try to balance these scales. As long as I've got more bad or more good than bad, then I'll be okay. It doesn't work that way. That's not what God is looking for. I think it's just interesting here in Ezekiel that things are so bad that not even a man like Noah is going to bring anyone else out with him. We look at the story of the flood. We see Noah, we see his wife, we see his 3 sons, we see their wives. We're not told really anything about the righteous condition of his family. We know Noah himself is a very righteous man. We assume that his family is the same way. Every indication we have doesn't seem to say otherwise. But when God says, it would be Noah himself, that's it, no sons, no daughters. That seems to sound even worse than what was going on in Genesis chapter 6. So just a really interesting thought, a really probably a helpful way to look at it as far as when we're studying Jerusalem in this era, how bad it really was. Because we always say, well, they had the temple, they had the priesthood. It couldn't have been that bad. But then you see a passage like this, and it's like, well, it's that bad. It's really bad. So I think our understanding of Noah helps us understand Ezekiel a bit more. And Ezekiel using Noah as an example here helps us understand that, yes, Noah raised the righteous man, and he is not like the rest of these people. Go ahead, Arnold.
In all of those instances where you speak of destruction of, the places and people that God has told us about,
Mm-hmm.
in each instance, they had everything they needed to be motivated. Noah was all the preaching he did,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody shrugged it off and went their own way and did their own thing. Later on, Jerusalem, they wouldn't keep the law as God had commanded. So we too have our boundaries. We know what we should and should not do. But if we neglect that and go another path, then what do we expect?
Yeah, that's on us, right? and the mercy of God is so great. He gives us time to figure it out too. I'm thinking back to when we talked about King Ahab back in our Elisha study. How many times has Ahab given a chance to see that God is in control? God is doing things. It's clear as day. There's no question about it. Ahab can't stand there and say, well, no, God isn't real or God's not in control, because he's in it. He sees it happen with his own eyes. And yet, over and over again, he decides, nah, I'm not really interested. Unless God's going to help me out, then I'll be interested. If he helps me out in the way I want, then for a brief moment, there's some alignment, but that doesn't last very long. It doesn't work that way. Even before Noah's time, we talked about Enoch. The description we get in Jude about Enoch is he was prophesying about men of his time, people who were deceivers, people who were doing wickedness. As Jude is describing in the New Testament time, these men are evil, these men are wicked. And Enoch was calling it out. And did that change? No, not really. In fact, as we've kind of gone through this timeline up to the flood, it seems that things got kind of worse and worse and worse progressively over time. We don't get a ton of detail about it, but the little details we do get seem to show that man was on this course and he was not getting off that course. Even though God gave them ample time, they had plenty of generations to figure it out. And this is the same with Judah and with Israel. God sent prophet after prophet after prophet. And maybe for a time they would listen, maybe a few would listen, but they never changed their way. They were always caught up in what they wanted to do, in their own wickedness and their own idolatry. And God, in Ezekiel chapter 14, he's laying out this argument that, yeah, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to pronounce this judgment, and you're going to see it, and you're going to take solace in it, because you're going to see how great that wickedness was, and you're going to see that wickedness be destroyed. So just a real, people hearing this in Ezekiel's time who would know the story of Noah, that should have been a wake-up call. When you hear the name Noah and judgment, you should be like, hey, I should pay attention to this. Something really bad is about to happen. But as we know, many did not. Jeff, you have your hand up?
It's a fascinating passage that speaks of two judgments of God. God judges nations, and that does not mean that if you're in a nation that God delivers, that you are righteous. It also doesn't mean that if you're in a nation that God condemns to be lost, that you are necessarily yourself lost. Those are two different things. And people get so upset and struggle. And maybe I should back up and say people often struggle with the concept of God destroying nations. decide that it's fair. The point is, God never promised us we would have certain years in this world or certain things in this life. And so, if we say that God is mean because I only live 60 years, or even 20 years for that, or I died as a baby, we recognize that babies are safe in God's arms. They are not lost. So they are delivered for eternity. That's our, at least that's our understanding from what the Bible teaches. They are definitely not condemned because the sin is not counted against them. Now, as adults, our sin is accounted against us, but if we're righteous, if we live by faith, our sins are forgiven, and we are righteous even if we're in a wicked nation. So yes, the nation may be destroyed. It's not unfair for God to treat this world. All of our blessings are gratis. We don't deserve them. They are unmerited favor. Everything, our food, our clothes, everything. And so it's never unfair if I live in a nation that's destroyed and I'm younger.
Yeah.
It's not unfair.
And I think we need to be careful when we complain against God about fairness, because as you were kind of mentioning, everything we have is given to us. It's not like I did anything to say like, oh, this is mine, because of things I did because of my own abilities, of my own existence. Like, obviously that doesn't make any sense. And if we really got what was due to us, none of us would be reconciled to God. So when we demand fairness from God and he says, okay, you better be careful about what you're about to get, because God is merciful above all other things. You go to James chapter 2, mercy triumphs over judgment. That's God. Now, he's going to be just, but he's going to be merciful first. And we had better not scorn that mercy. So we have to be very careful when we start to think, well, God is not doing right here, or God is not being fair to us, as if we have any sense of fairness or unbiasedness ourselves. Do you have a follow-up? Oh, okay, go ahead, James.
I was just saying, like, fairness to you. I think that the Father is more than fair. We are given more than enough opportunity, and everything He gives us is an opportunity for us to be able to get closer to Him.
Exactly, and that's the thing is God is merciful to the point that He will give us opportunities. And if you think about it, if people got exactly what they were supposed to get at that point in time, but that nation of Israel never makes it through the wilderness. Forget about it. It's done. We have to be. God is patient with us, and we need to be thankful for that. You have a follow-up there, Jeff?
One other thing I want to mention is God brings judgments down upon nations for two reasons. Number one, they cease to function as God ordained that they function. The ruler is supposed to be a terror to evil. He is supposed to reward that which is good, and provide security and peace. And when he fails to do that, at some point he no longer functions, and God brings him down and raises up someone who will do those things. That's a separate matter from righteousness, totally. But God also synonymously uses destruction upon evil nations as a metaphor for us to learn a lesson about life. Jesus, and it just flew out of my mind. Jesus pointed out the same thing when he talked about the idea that mankind is not always treated in exactly the way he's treated the way he lives, but his judgment eternally is not, his judgment in this life is not based upon always his conduct. Boy, it didn't come out right. It was a really, really important point, and it's gone. That's as close as I can get back to it.
Okay.
But the point is, we should not take God's judgments on this nation personally. I'm not a bad person because the nation around me is falling apart. And when it does happen, I need to remain righteous to God like Noah did. And it's interesting, you talk about Noah, Job, and what was the other one?
Daniel.
They were in times when they
Well, we know Job was in a really tough situation himself, as far as.
It doesn't really say a lot about society.
Sure, I guess not.
But certainly we know with Noah.
The few people we know who were around him weren't very helpful. Go ahead, James.
Well, it seems like the things that man is supposed to do for the Creator, the things that man was told to do by the Creator, man doesn't. When it comes down to things that he would have us to do. For example, God told mankind back in the Old Testament, do not marry women from other lands. And when they do, it stops them from being able to worship the Father the way that he would have us to. Looking at Baal and witchcraft and all of the sins that, the Levites were doing in the 400 years of silence that led up to the birth of Christ. Not worshiping the Father the way that he told you to. Same thing here today. Because if we do not worship the Father the way that we were told to, none of this is never going to work. So if you're in a Baptist religion or if you're doing Hinduism or if you're in a Muslim religion, these are not the ways that God told us to worship him. I know there's similarities, everybody coming from Abraham, but there are other parts of Abraham's lineage with Esau and with Ishmael that is not pleasing in God's sight.
Mm-hmm.
So the Father has to have a plan. And his plan is for us to have the Messiah to come through the lineage of Abraham. Even though Abraham has a lot of kids and a lot of different even though there are a lot of different people that were related to him and cousins and that sort of thing. So my point here is that it all comes to obedience to the word of God, worship him the way that he told us to, and following the instructions that he has given us.
And being careful not to compromise those.
Not so much for all the people that came before Christ, but especially for all of us who came after Christ. Things are different now. So if your worship is not right, then you don't have salvation. You have life here on earth for your 80 years or your 100 years or whatever it is. But like you had said earlier, we should be afraid of not the one who can kill the body, but the one who can kill the body and the soul.
And getting back to your initial point about the warning of the Israelites not to intermarry with the other nations around them was because of their idolatry. It's not that God did not have any consideration for other people outside of Israel. And we know that because we have the story of Jonah. Why is Jonah going up to Nineveh? These aren't Israelites. They have nothing to do with God. But God says, there's 120,000 people in this city. Should I not care for them as well? That's how the story ends, period. Should I not care for them as well? God cared for everybody. His concern for the Israelites was that they were going to compromise their service to him by going and intermarrying with nations that did not serve him. And we see that example with Solomon. He builds the temple of the Lord. He's the son of David. He must be a man of great faith, but look how his wives took his heart in all sorts of different directions and all the idolatry that started spreading after that point. We look at, I'm going to use Ahab as another example again. He was already probably a pretty bad seed, but you look at his wife, she makes it worse. He marries the daughter of the king of Sidon, Jezebel. She comes down, she brings with her all this Baal worship. He builds a temple to Baal in Samaria, which should be the complete opposite of what he should be doing. He should be going down to Jerusalem, to where the temple of the Lord is. He's not doing that. He's building an idol temple, which is later destroyed, but it didn't stop. The damage was done. He compromised everything. And every time you see that compromise, that's where trouble comes in. And that's where we see places like Ezekiel, where the people have compromised their service to God so much, they're not serving God anymore. They're so far from it that they might as well be the people of Sodom and Gomorrah or the people of Noah's time before the flood. it might as well be like that, is kind of the indication I get from passages like Ezekiel 14. Now, we get other examples where people who are not Israelites did marry into Israelite families, but that was because they were willing to change and serve God. We're going to talk about some of them in this study. The most notable one we get a lot of information about is Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. She was not an Israelite, but the moment she says to her mother-in-law, to Naomi, she says, let your people be my people, let your God be my God. She's willing to make that change. She's not going to bring in her idol worship with her and say, well, yeah, we'll have your God, and here, let me pack my idols up, and we'll go into town, and we'll set them up when we get there. There's none of that. She's willing to change everything. Rahab is another example of that. We'll probably touch on a few more. But that's the difference, is are we going to compromise our service to God or not? There's no in between there. It's either yes or no. Go ahead, Arnold. You had your hand up.
To the point that Israel was given, a special place in God's sight at that time, they compromised that when they disobeyed. So it's going to be the same now. Israel was an example for the people around.
Yeah.
They were supposed to. So we are supposed to be an example for the people around us. And we still should seek God for everything, because there's not going to be another example. This is it.
Yeah. And the thing we need to realize too is we're going to be example either way. We're going to be a good example or a bad example. Again, there's no in between here. That's not how it works. So very good. Let's turn over to the New Testament. I got 10 minutes to do a whole bunch of more stuff. I want to finish Noah, but this is all great conversation. This is the reason we want to study things like this. I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but if you go to Matthew chapter 24, and we also have this in Luke chapter 17, we have Jesus using Noah as an example when discussing the future destruction of Jerusalem and also talking about end times. Basically, that life would be going on as normal before these major events take place. He says it's in, I'm going to read from Matthew 24. Luke 17 is pretty similar. I'm not going to read both. Matthew 24, I'm going to start reading in verse 36. He says, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, up to the day Noah had entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So he's using this analogy here. And again, people who should understand the story of Noah. These are Israelites he's talking to. He's in Jerusalem, and he's saying, here's how it's going to be when the Son of Man comes back. It's going to be like when the flood came, people were going about their business as usual. They were eating, they were drinking, there were people being given in marriage. It was like any other day. It might as well have been a Tuesday for all we know. Just some normal day, and God's judgment comes. And I think about when we talk, and there are people who have all sorts of interesting ideas about the final judgment, the end times, the last day, whatever you want to call it, and they're looking for signs, and they're looking through Revelation, saying, well, I'm going to calculate, it'll be this day that God will come back, or Jesus will come back, and that'll be the day of judgment. And that day comes and goes, and say, well, I must have miscalculated somewhere. Let me recheck my numbers here. It's going to be like any other day. You're not going to know that day. It might as well be a Tuesday for all we know. It's going to be. It could be tomorrow. Tomorrow's not going to be very exciting as far as I know. It could be Tuesday. Who knows? We don't know. That is the whole point that Jesus is making here, is there's not going to be some grand sign that's going to let you know, hey, God's judgment is coming tomorrow. You got 24 hours to make it right. It's going to be like any other day, and then God's judgment is going to come.
That's why we got to stay ready.
And that's why we have to be ready. And Jesus makes a parable about that, actually a few, where it's, if you're not ready when that time comes, you're not going to have time to go and get ready. It's too late. Yeah, exactly. Very good. I'm not going to get too much more into that because I have other verses I want to get to, but Any comments, any thoughts about that before we move on to a few more New Testament passages? Okay. I'm not going to read this for the sake of time, but if you go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, I do want to mention that Noah is mentioned there as one of the ones of faith. It says by his faith, he built an ark to save his family. By his actions that are propelled by his faith, he builds an ark to save his family. It says by his actions, he condemned the wicked of the world and became an heir of righteousness. Now, we think that, hey, self-preservation should be enough, but also the way he acted up to the flood, the way he followed instructions from God to build that ark, shows that he was not going to be like the rest of the world. And sometimes people don't like that when they see a righteous person living righteously because it convicts them of something and they don't like that feeling. Maybe Noah was doing that. Maybe he had some hostility with the people around him. There have been thoughts about that. We don't get a lot of detail in Genesis about that. But Hebrews 11 makes it clear that Noah was not like the other people of his time. And that's one of the reasons he's in that chapter of Hebrews chapter 11. Comments on that? I wasn't going to read it through because I want to get to Peter, because Peter says a lot about Noah. Okay, let's turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3, if you would. Peter likes to talk about Noah. He does it a couple times. So I'm going to read for us 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 22, please. 18 through 22.
For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited, in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him.
Okay. I really like this verse for a few reasons, but one of the reasons I like to turn to this is when I'm talking to people about the necessity of baptism. We get this very interesting kind of symbolism here. I guess I'll say it that way. Symbolism of Noah is surrounded by water. Everything is destroyed around him. Just him and his family and the animals on the ark are spared. That's it. That's the only ones that are spared. And now he's saving, now this baptism, if you will, this water is going to save you from your sins. It's not about washing the dirt off of your body. It's about pledging a good conscience toward God. There's a symbolism here. So when people say, oh, we don't need baptism here, I could say, well, did Noah not need to be in that flood situation then? Like, how is that going to play out? Does he not need to build that ark? How do we want to discuss that? Because he's saying these things had to happen. These were important. This is like baptism. So how do we take that out? How do we say, well, we don't need baptism? I look at this and say, well, Peter seems to say quite the opposite. There's a bit more in here than that, but I think that's very interesting, using the flood as a symbol for baptism. Any comments, questions on this passage in 1 Peter? Go ahead.
It's kind of complicated, but it seems to indicate that by the Spirit, the message of Jesus was preached by Noah to those people. They were in the prison of sin. Okay, we know this is not, some people have the idea that Jesus, when he died on the cross, went down to the grave and preached to those people who died in the flood, singled them out for some reason. As if anything could be done for them at that point, which we know the Bible teaches not possible. Once you die, your judgment is sealed. And so we know that can't be the way the wording is pointing us. What it's saying is that it says in verse 20 that he puts to death in the flesh, but we are made alive by the Spirit, by whom, talking about the Spirit, Jesus went, by whom he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. So he identifies who this is talking about, the days of Noah.
Yeah, reconciliation to God.
And
Yeah,
reconciliation
yeah.
to God. And that's the message he preached to those people while he was building the ark. And of course, no one got on the ark with him, but nevertheless, they did receive the opportunity, as Arnold said.
Yeah, and the patience of God there. And you could even add on to that, I wouldn't object to, all the generations that came before that flood. There were already problems. I mean, we can go back and reference Enoch again. There were already problems before Noah was on the scene here. But he gives them several generations to figure it out. He gives him time, like the generations of the Israelites and the people of Judah, who get all these prophets over and over again. It's not, oh, you guys sinned, okay, that's it. It's done now. He's going to give them time to come back. Some do, most don't. But yeah, that's a great point, that there's not punishment without a message first. There's definitely, it's not like they were ignorant of what they were supposed to be doing, or God was being unfair. We've talked about that. God is giving them every opportunity. Absolutely.
And it's interesting, you think about this is another metaphor. Noah built an ark. Christ built the church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Jesus' blood saves us. You're not saved just because you're in the church, but the saved are added to the church. So seems to me there's a correlation there. Noah was a builder and a prophet and did God's will. Jesus also was a builder and a prophet in terms of providing the things we need to be in God's family.
Absolutely. Any other comments on 1 Peter? I'm going to go to 2 Peter real quick if we don't. Okay. Let's go to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2. Again, I'm not going to read this because we're technically out of time now, but I'm going to finish this. Most of you who know this passage really well will basically describe this as, here's Peter's warning against the false teachers, the false prophets, which is, that's basically what this chapter is about. But he does mention Noah in here, specifically in verse 5, where Noah and the flood are used as one of the many examples that Peter uses of God's righteous judgment of those who are wicked, and how the righteous are spared. He goes through actually quite a long list. At the beginning of the chapter, he talks about the false prophets, those who are teaching false things. They're trying to do all these things that are bringing destruction. They're following these terrible things. And then he gets into verse 4, and he starts talking about these examples with not sparing angels when they sinned, did not spare the ancient world, but brought upon the flood, but protected Noah. In verse 6, he condemns the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but then he rescues Lot, who was a righteous man in his time. And it kind of goes on with things like that. And then what those men are like. They're bold, they're arrogant, they're creating terrible, terrible things, but God's judgment is going to be upon them. That's basically the summation of the chapter, which if we had more time, I might talk about it a little bit more longer. But he uses Noah here specifically to show that these false teachers might as well be the wicked people from Noah's time. And he talks about other examples too, which solidify that. But we know when we talked about Genesis, what was the state of the world in Noah's time? Every man's heart was only evil all the time. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And he's saying these false teachers, these false prophets, these are just like those people. And sometimes we think, somebody's saying something they don't quite understand, or they're just having a quick power trip. It's not a big deal. Or, hey, we're making a little compromise here. It'll be okay. Maybe this will work out well. They might as well be the people from Noah's time. That's not a glowing recommendation by any means. That is the watch out. That is the warning lights. You should be seeing red flashes everywhere saying, hey, this is bad. Careful here, like hazard ahead. That's what this is. Don't give in to these ideas. And Paul talks about this too in several of his letters, to watch out for people like this who, quote, bring another gospel that was not taught to them before, or some new message or some new revelation. Paul says, what we taught to you is everything you need to know. Like there's nothing to add to Christ. Christ is complete in all of his things. And you can look at many quote-unquote Christian denominations that more than anything love to add things onto what the Bible has for us. Or they go off and add a whole nother subsection to God. Like, oh, here's we had our Old Testament, we had the New Testament. Now we have to have the even newer Testament, if you will. And it keeps going, and there's no end to it. And every time that happens, it says, oh, well, that seems to contradict something we saw before. Yeah, warning, these are like the people in Noah's time. So I think Peter uses these examples, and he uses other ones that people understand that these are bad things. When you hear these things, when you see these people teaching these quote unquote, new gospels, new revelations, watch out, because you might be getting into a trap that's going to be just as bad as these instances of mankind. So that's really all I had to say about 2 Peter chapter 2. I think it's super important. It's a great study on its own, but I'm just mentioning it because Noah is mentioned there. Comments, questions about Noah, his place in 2 Peter or 2 Peter chapter 2 that we want to touch on before we close? Okay. Thank you all for bearing with me as we went through Noah. I'm done with Noah. We'll move on next week. We're out of time. Next week, we'll start talking about Shem. One thing I will note that we're going to have not a lot to say about the people from Shem to Terah before we get to Abraham. Once we get to Abraham, we'll have a whole lot to talk about like we had with Noah. A lot of these guys in between are just going to be names. We're not going to know really anything about them except for their place in the lineage, really. Some will have some details about Shem, Peleg, Nahor, Terah. We get some things about. Of course, we have to define which Nahor we're talking about. We'll get to that. But there's not going to be a lot, so we'll probably get through all of them probably next week. I expect to either start Abraham next week or the week after. These guys won't take nearly as long as Noah. So there's no other comments or anything. We'll stop there, and we'll move on with Shem next week.